Thank you so much, Rafi, and thank you so much to CFocus and Artistry for having us here today. Before we start proper, I just want to briefly introduce sort of the curatorial concept behind the talks program and also this panel itself. So when I was invited to respond to John Tung's curation for CFocus, the Human Agency, I was really thinking about what it means to be of agency and to be in practice. Zoe Butt, who actually moderated the earlier panel, had really reminded me a few months ago that to be in practice means to be in action and to be in doing. And Chris on the panel here is one of those people who often speak to me about what does it mean when we're working with these big speculative frameworks, and how can we translate them into works, into spaces, into gatherings, and more. So I think it's a real privilege to have here today Lawrence, Joe, and Chris, all three of you who are thinking about different kinds of visions of presence and futures, really fostering polyphonic ways of being together, and how that translate into different forms in your work, both in the artwork itself, but also in your broader practice, whether that's with other people, with communities, and so on. So in this panel, Moulding Futures, we're really thinking about what does it mean for these practitioners to be creating sort of guidelines or visions for what we're looking ahead, whether from a sort of almost cautionary perspective or from one that offers alternative ways of moving forward. So we're going to start with having each of you introduce yourself for about 5 minutes or so. And then we're going to start with the very macro, the kind of speculative, abstract ideas that they're working with, and then slowly distilling that down to understanding how each of you translate these ideas into practice, and then how do you bring that outwards. So first up, we have Chris, a dear friend and collaborator. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Fussner, the founder and creative director of Tropical Futures. So we're a brand that focuses on connecting Filipinos and Southeast Asians globally through design and research projects that span across subcultures, and we manifest that into different objects, such as zines, clothing collections, textiles. So currently, most recently, we've been working on a project that deals with buduts, which is an electronic music genre that comes from southern Philippines. So we work with a handful of artists, record labels, and venues. We conduct research, create artwork, and sort of manifest and translate some of the research around the genre into objects, into album artwork, and into different sort of types of artistic formation. Another project right now we're working on is researching speedboat racing culture in the Philippines called Bangkarera. So it's a project that deals with speed, velocity, also just thinking about the archipelago as an interconnected network and what it means for nautical design in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia in 2025. But rewinding a little bit in the context of this talk, Tropical Futures has been many other things besides a brand. Initially, it started out as personal practice, whereby in the academy, I was really trained more in like design research and speculative design. And at that point, I was sort of looking at the projects, sort of the examples through pop culture, through exhibitions, and was questioning. I was like, why aren't there any really any futures that relate to where I'm from, which is Singapore and the Philippines? And that sort of led me to start questioning the idea of futures. And I think at the time, you obviously had Hollywood futures, Afrofuturism, and then some of Lawrence's early work, Sino-futurism, around this time really influenced tropical futures in terms of thinking about alternative futures. And fortunately today, we have a plethora of futures, and I think futuring and the concept of futuring to a certain extent has been industrialized, but also it's become more common in artistic and design practice through the space. So winding back, that sort of led me to do certain projects that explored the idea of tropical futures, and really it's in the semantics of the title of combining buzzwords together. Initially it was Tropical Futures Institute, and just the sort of the combination of those buzzwords was also a critique on the lack, I shouldn't say lack, but the shortage of cultural capital in Southeast Asia or in the majority world. So beyond that, like when I moved to the Philippines in the mid-2010s, Tropical Futures really manifested, on a personal level, manifested as a way for me to connect with Cebu and the Philippines, basically cultural scene, and we ran a cultural space there that included a residency and a broad-based program, and that lasted for about 5 years or so, and that program encompassed everything from new media shows to more traditional shows to parties, zine fests, and really encapsulated a time where the practice was more hyper-localized to where I was living and sort of making an impact in that sort of space. And as that sort of went on, that also led us to do work in the commercial art space, where we had the privilege of participating in C-Focus and Art.SG as a gallery in a cultural space for a number of years. And then basically up until COVID, that sort of transition became more into a practice that was more, I think, more at large, and working with collaborators remotely on projects that in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore, and sort of departing from the localized practice in the Philippines. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Next, Joe, if you could tell us a bit about your practice.
Hi, I'm Jo Ho. I'm a media artist based here in Singapore, and I primarily work with video work, digital installation, and generative systems, so generative platforms. And I often think about my work through the lens of the machine. So in a lot of my work, I try to embody that machine logic, but obviously I cannot fully embody it. I'm still human. So there's that tension between the machine vision versus like the human vision, right? From my own perspective. I actually have a background in architecture. So when I first started making art, it was a lot about creating environments. And actually, when I finished my master's, it was 2020. COVID, just started, and then everyone was online. And then there's this one platform that came on online that everyone was trying out, and it was called Art Breeder. So that started my journey into trying to breed images together using AI and machine learning. And a lot of my early practice was trying to create environments and fictions through these blending of forms. So these were very much like speculative architecture, stemming from my interest in creating alternate spaces, or I don't know, I really like fantasy, really like sci-fi, so it's like trying to build my own worlds. Yeah, and then recently I've been transitioning into more digital installation where it's like a hybrid between physical and also using platforms. Because I think like nowadays, as we're moving farther and farther away from understanding our very sleek devices that we cannot really hack anymore, everything's getting smaller and smaller, getting sleeker and sleeker. I think we forget that a lot of the digital assets that we consume online, all the media that we see on TikTok or whatever, Instagram, all of it is hosted on really physical things. So in my recent work, I've been trying to bring the physicality and the visceral nature of physical objects into my installations. Apart from that, I also have a collective, and we throw parties here in Singapore, but what we do is very much world building. So because we're a queer collective, we're kind of like creating this bubble, this safe space for our community. And every time we throw a party or a gathering, we work together with like lighting artists, sound artists, installation artists to create a world. So there's always a theme, and then there's also a dress code. So when people come in, they get fully immersed in like music, installation, people, community, and ideas. Yeah, so that's what I'm doing now.
Thank you so much, Joe. And last but not least, Lawrence.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a media artist and spatial designer and filmmaker based in London. And I guess my practice really evolves around two central questions, which are very basic. One is, where am I? And the second is, when am I? I guess what I mean by this is the forms of spatial practice I'm interested in aren't necessarily things that we might associate with art making. I mean, you know, having a talk in the midst of an art fair where by and large most work is painting and sculpture makes me think a lot about the vernacular media that I grew up with and were my entry point into the idea of being an artist, you know, films, video games, comics, books, music, forms where the world building is not necessarily like kind of fixed to a specific artifact. And it took many, many years over experimentation between transforming a spatial practice into something with multiple dimensions. I'm always interested in this idea of a time lag where there's certain forms or ways of distribution that start in one place and then migrate to another. So I worked as a musician for quite a long time, and it was, you know, since the MySpace days where you could actually, like, the good old days, you have a community, you bring it online, they become your friends and then also your tribe, so to speak. And this rooting in this, like, collective, which would only be born from an earlier form of social media, was really kind of central to my idea of building this new practice. From growing up, I think there were three fantasy technologies that only have started to be actually more fully realized. One is AI, another is virtual reality, and I think another is the internet. And you know, this goes back to a more like 1990s vision of what cyberpunk, or the future of this more utopian networked world that can somehow exceed the limitations of like everyday reality. And so for me, over time, AI in a sense became both a subject but also the main protagonist in the film. Virtual reality, even if it's not necessarily with a headset, became the medium, you know, hybridizing the space between a virtual world and a video game and an architectural installation. And I guess the internet was a minor input into my practice, but is actually one that finds its way into the work. Like some of the slides behind are from different films and videos, and so in some of them, the lives of the characters inside those films have their lives being governed by technology. So over the last decade of practice, I've been really interested in this idea of not just me as an artist, but the idea of a fictional artist, which has, you know, a very long history in many different mythologies and in many different cultures. And so in a way, like, because I'm less interested in the idea of like, who am I, and this idea of identity driving the practice, I'm always trying to like position myself inside the mind of another creature, sometimes an AI, who also wants to be an artist. And then their mentality becomes part of my world building inside the work. So for example, Geomancer is about a surveillance satellite born in Singapore who wants to be an artist, and instead of being decommissioned, they kind of deliberately come down and escape their obsolescence in order to kind of fulfill their dreams. Because I think drawing these parallels between, you know, everyday reality as a digital creator, basically, and what future machines or future beings might experience is a really important entry point. So finally, through making different installations and video games and films, I hope to make an open world where each different medium is like an entry point into the world, because I find that some people have natural affinity or natural bias against certain media. Like, for example, it took a long time to essentially persuade a certain cultural lover that video games are art as well. Electronic music is a form of, valid expression moreover than, classical instrumentation. So this delay lag, I think, is really interesting, because being an artist also gives me freedom in using new technologies, but with a different goal. And I don't know what the goal is, which is a question that often comes up, in people working with technology. Very often you get challenged by saying, oh, like, have you thought of, getting car sponsorship? Have you thought of harvesting the data where people play your game and you can, to be honest, very market-driven approaches to cultural creativity. And I feel lucky that, having this framework of visual arts very broadly gives a certain freedom in experimentation. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think also what is so exciting to me about this session is getting to hear a bit more about, the ideas that drove you, the different kinds of visions that maybe prompted you to the work that you do now. And it was really great to actually hear, for example, Lawrence, some of, these questions that you ask yourself, because I think so many of your works, for example, have, you mentioned Geomancer, you mentioned some of your earlier works, I think are often credited as one of the practitioners to really play and build out these ideas around Sino-futurism. And the ideas, the speculations, they started maybe with you, maybe with others. You can share a bit more about that. But that led towards, really big conversations around like really big world kind of topics or ways for us to, it offered language and tools for us to talk about things happening around us. So I think moving maybe into this next question, I really like to hear from each of you a little bit about how do you start to translate, maybe a key idea that you've been working with, and bringing that into whether it's one particular artwork, or one particular project or gathering or party or rave or maybe a merch, Chris, that became something that has more material, that's either tangible or visual or directly kind of affective, which then opened up portals for people to start stepping into these worlds that you're speculating or building. Whoever wants to start first. Maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Maybe I'll start first. I think what I like to do is to just inhabit, I don't know, like a VR game or just play games in general, or, I don't know, experience the process of making a generated image, or to train it myself, like to embed myself within the process. And then eventually, as you're working with these platforms, like thoughts come up and then questions come up, and then in my head I want to like break it apart, disassemble it, and then reassemble it and present it in a different way. For me, it's all about kind of like questioning the things that are somehow given to you, whether it's like a platform like TikTok and then like or YouTube, and trying to understand why people have the compulsion to consume certain content, and trying to embody or inhabit that world. So yeah, for me, it's a lot about inhabiting different worlds and environments, trying to take it apart and present it in an alternate way that sort of like refers back to itself or asks certain questions. Yeah.
Just building off of that, Joe, would you like to give us like a particular example, maybe in recent work? I know you have 2 exhibitions on right now. If you'd like to maybe talk about one of them.
I have this work at Starch right now, and it's called Flesh Drive. And in this work, I looked at a lot of mukbang videos. So for research, I like consumed hundreds of mukbang videos on TikTok, on YouTube, because I myself have this vicarious pleasure that I feel from watching other people like gorge themselves. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one here. I'm sure you guys also get pleasure from watching people eat or like hearing the ASMR sounds of crunches, of like they also whisper. They're like, now I'm gonna eat this, blah, 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 blah. You know, like stuff like that. So I paired that along with like the interface of a latex screen. So in this work, I really wanted to investigate the types of visceral effects that you get from watching really digital things. But also, these people are eating what they call, it's like the Cedric Gourlet. You know those fruit pastries? They look really like realistic fruits, but they're actually cake. It's like, is it cake or not? So yeah, and there's also this juxtaposition between the virtual body and the physical body within the artwork itself. One that is a journey inside a virtual body, like in VR chat, I made like this virtual world where you're inside guts. But then there's also footage of my actual surgery because I had to take out my gallbladder. Because eating food back then, like it would cause some pain. So it was like a little bit of investigating physical, what do you call it, like consequences when you're consuming digital things. Yeah.
It sounds like it's very personal, and you first start by putting yourself into these environments and then really thinking about the affective on your own body, using that as maybe a starting point or a way to enter the conversation, and then how thinking about translating these experiences for other people. I'm curious, maybe we can start with Lawrence. If you want to maybe talk a bit about your current exhibition on at Art Signs, which where interaction, that sort of dialogue with the works itself is very much woven into the experience.
So the main project at Art Science Museum, it's a fictional rehab center for rogue self-driving cars. And the title is NOx, which is an acronym for non-human excellence. So non-human excellence is what I imagine, let's say, a self-driving car company, a BYD or a Tesla, would call their rehab program for cars that are malfunctioning. So the experience itself is basically like there's a shrine-like electric car charging station, but instead of electric car charging, there's a video game where visitors take on the role of a trainee car therapist, basically. So there's a video game, and then there's also 2 other videos where basically you watch the cars undergoing therapy. This second work in the show is a sequel to the project called Guanyin, where you play as a care bot exploring the interior of a car and trying to fix the car before they crash. So both these projects are part of an ongoing series called basically the Smart City series, in which I'm trying to think of questions of like AI and non-human intelligence, but where the visitor is playing from the role of the non-human being. This idea of having AI as a subject goes back to the video essay Sino-Futurism, where it was one of the first times I really started inquiring into like, if places like Singapore or East Asia, Southeast Asia more broadly speaking, are often referred to as previously like tiger economies, melting pots, the future of whatever world economies. I was wondering back in 2016, why is it there's so little discourse from, a Southeast Asian perspective? Because very often conversations about these political ideas are very often driven by academia or academic research, which is largely from Western institutions. So Sino-Futurism, instead of taking this kind of Western humanist approach, takes this idea of like, hang on, what if you take the cliches of Chinese industrial development, copying, computing, gaming, studying, and labor, and actually took these as essentially the starting points of a new kind of creative mindset. So many years later, that filtered into me creating these fictional artists who embody this Sino-futurist point of view. So all of these self-driving cars in Knox have really taken on this idea of what if actually I don't have any pure soul or individuality? What if I am just a product of my machine learning algorithms? Is it still possible to have a soul after that? So there's a link between these more like, I guess, political ideas and cultural ideas and the subject of the work, and it's wrapped in together with video games and an architectural practice.
Thank you so much. And Chris, I think with you, there's also, I'm thinking about, I mentioned merch earlier, because I'm also thinking about your background as a designer and the different kind of forms through which, ideas of Tropical Futures Institute have translated. Yesterday, Chris and I were also in another talk together. It was a crit club organized by Jem at the STPI symposium. And in preparing for the session together, I was really struck by how Chris approached the visuality of his slides versus mine. I'm a curator, more of like, maybe I work more with words, kind of abstract ideas. That's why I was also so leaning into this idea of this talk. And Chris, being someone I think that has a lot more like graphic capability, the way that you approach, translating the ideas that we were both speaking about, but giving them a fun and engaging tangible form. I was really struck by that kind of difference between how we're speaking about the same thing, but they could translate in such different ways. So in touching then upon this idea of interactivity and embodiment, inviting people into the ideas that you have by literally, for example, asking them to step into the character or into that being. Chris, with your works, I'm wondering if you could also talk a bit about how this ideas translate.
Yeah, for sure. So my background is more in design research, and in particular, I used to focus on researching hardware and around the space of innovation. So some of the early work I used to do before Tropical Futures was researching resiliency in cities through decentralized mesh networks, and looking at certain edge technologies and how they diffuse into society, and how society adopts certain technologies over time. And so the idea of diffusion and adoption and transmission is really the core foundation of my work. And in sort of some of the merch that Clara was talking about relates to basically my time as a youth in Singapore. I used to spend a lot of time. I was born here. I grew up here. I used to spend a lot of time at Far East Plaza and just hang out in shops and collecting graphic tees. So some of the earlier works we've done were really about accelerating certain, or just being, I guess, the way I would frame it is, for Tropical Futures, we, think about ourselves as sort of a node in a swarm where there's obviously a lot of other people thinking along the same lines. Obviously the synchronicity and being inspired by Lawrence, and also other people thinking about ideas of Tropical Futures. So some of the earlier projects were about pushing certain vernacular aesthetics, especially those relating to Southeast Asia, and ideas of, I guess, references that are from our culture, and sort of in response to, I guess, more Western or predominantly Western or Westocentric sort of aesthetic ideals and cultural reference points. So that really influenced some of the earlier designs, and right now, had the pleasure of being commissioned by the Biennale to produce a series of merch pieces, and one of the pieces we developed was about Tanjung Pagar railway station. And that work stems back to a t-shirt I did about Far East Plaza, which was a very important place to me growing up. And in a lot of ways, that work was also informed by Royston Tan's work about, he has an amazing video, which is blanking in my mind, about certain spaces in Singapore that have disappeared over time. And it's sort of like creating that sort of, going back to networks, it's like sort of stringing that sort of connectivity through a certain space or place or visual identifier, and sort of like creating that connectivity through that piece. So for the Tanjong Railway piece, we went into archives, we looked at a lot of documentary footage, and it was actually quite an emotional piece for myself, just because I never really took the train to KL. I mean, I had the opportunity to eat a Ramly burger a couple times there, but it was really about like sort of creating a design taxonomy from a certain place and time in the station and connecting these sort of points in that station to create sort of this network that encapsulates a certain moment in time. And yeah, that's pretty much how we approach the work. Like earlier I was mentioning about like Buduts or Bancarera. So these are all sort of subcultures, and I mean now Buduts is becoming a much more popular music genre, but the work is still in line with the idea of diffusing a certain concept or a certain aesthetic, and very much so like our earlier participation in some of these art fairs in ArtSG, Art Dubai, and doing that sort of commercial side of things was also in line with the idea of being a vessel or someone that's transmitting or accelerating a certain idea or aesthetic.
If we could just stay on this topic for a while, on these like strategies to like visualize. Something I'm also thinking about as you're all speaking is that you're working with rather either personal or very complex kind of systems. Whether they originate, for example, Joe, you spoke about your own body, your own experience, but thinking about these larger questions around our relationships with the screen, with technology, Lawrence, of course, as well, and finding ways to make this legible. And I also want to sort of talk about, Joe, if you could, about some of your works from Joe and Copy that think about, for example, like language logic behind large language models, or artwork experimented on blockchain, different kinds of systems. So if you could also maybe talk a bit about in that work mode, how you enter these very complex systems and translate them into works that are sort of very simple kind of interactions that allow people to actually enter that logic. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm also part of a collaborative duo, and we're called Joe and Copy. And I am in this duo with Kapilan Naidu, who's also a media artist here in Singapore. So the installations that we make, that we've been making since 2021, when we first met, are kind of like speculative platforms. So the first ever work that we did together, NFTs were really popular, and I was like, what is this? What does that mean for the value of digital assets when all that it's prescribed to this asset is like this number or like the token? So it all seemed so abstract to me, and I was just really frustrated with the way that everyone's talking about digital art, which is the monetary value that's like placed on it. So our first work, it's called Enzyme 1.0, and we invited 5 artists to show their works. And within the screens in the space, the audience were invited to scan a QR code, and they can bid on it, like own it in a closed system, right? So it's not with real money. It's not you're not actually purchasing it. It's kind of like this. It's a scenario, like a closed scenario. So the more that people engage with the QR code or engage with a work, the more that it starts to disintegrate. So on the artworks that were hosted on this NFT platform actually destroys the actual artwork. Ideally, we would have destroyed the actual JPEG, and there's like the only one JPEG in the world, of this. So that was one of the experiments that we did. Another one is called Enzyme 2.0, and then in this one we transform this kind of like critical thinking into LLMs. So within this work, we actually wrote an artist manifesto. So it's like filled with emotion, like exclamations, things from our heart, from our minds. And we put it through basically GPT. And then every time there's an audience that comes in, it starts to reinterpret the words of our manifesto, and it also manifests in an installation. It's kind of like you walk around it to read the text. But by the end of the exhibition, which was after 10 days, the manifesto grew like 3 times the size. It like totally inflated the words and the meanings, and by the end of it, it was kind of like whitewashed. The meaning was like so flimsy. There were no strong emotions. A lot of extra words that could be edited out. So this also came because we are also educators. So all of our students, they use ChatGPT to write their essays now. So everything is like inflated. Like we ask them for 100 words, it comes back in like an essay. And I'm like, we have to read all this. So this artwork also came as like from that experience as a critique of using GPT to translate your own words. And in the end, it's just meaningless.
I mean, that's such an interesting experience when you start with like a central idea of this manifesto and what happens to it when you bring it out into, a wider environment. And maybe with that also, I'd like to, ask the panel a bit about what happens when you're working on these projects. I mean, Lawrence, for example, these are big, almost monumental projects that really require a lot of different kinds of efforts, different kind of skill sets, requires teams of people to come together. And in your work, like how do you approach translating these ideas in a way that allows you to onboard your collaborators to share in these same visions, to understand maybe certain kinds of things you're trying to talk about, to seek resonance, and then build these worlds kind of together?
So I think it's really challenging as an artist when your practice grows to a certain scale. The way I think about it is because I feel I have so much experience doing DIY projects, like every element of, a construction or design or kind of rendering or, art making. I feel it's a real challenge to kind of think of how do you maintain the vision and how do you get a more ambitious project off the ground. Of course, in visual art in general, there's the myth of the solo author, and in different fields like video game design or design, in filmmaking, the division of labor or architecture, division of labor is already set up so that you can kind of like plug into a certain mechanized mode of production. I think for me to balance the overall worldview and the vision of a project, it means that you always have to translate between ideas for different collaborators. So for example, like in the Knox project, there's the architectural scenography, there's the videos and the kind of cinematography in the videos, and there's a video game and the game design. So for me, it's like the fundamental like axiomatic ideas of the world, which is, let's say there's a smart city inhabited by sentient self-driving cars, and there's a certain very powerful atmosphere that pervades throughout the whole mood. It's quite hard to articulate that in full all the time. So for me, the tools I use for different collaborators is it varies all the time. So very often in a very ambitious project like Knox, I actually start with the soundtrack first, because that gives a kind of emotional grounding to the world. And then after that, I've got this like non-linguistic sensibility or like affect in the world. Then I think, okay, this is what it will look like. This is what it'll look like in 3D, let alone, actually programming things. So I think this like various layering of, how should I put it? Like increasing resolution. So it starts like blurry, but it's a vibe, and then it goes to like actual 4K at the end. It's taken a very long time to develop that organically. Because the other thing I think when I was a student, I would always be really inspired by these site-specific sculptural practices, this like grand Oliver Elias and visions, and I'd be like, how the hell does that exist? And then later on, I realized there's a certain kind of economy, a certain kind of circulation and distribution that allows that to exist. And I thought, maybe for all of us, that logic that may have worked in the 1990s or 2000s absolutely does not exist for people who want to create a different form of culture. I mean, not as an ambitious thing, but just as an organic connection between like childhood wishes and like adult reality. So that always needs a lot of navigation.
Thanks for talking about that, because I think, oftentimes when you look at work like this, like, or, if you've been to Lawrence exhibition at the Art Science Museum already, you enter these, like, it's such a seamless world almost, right? And you're plugged in immediately. But as you said, it actually starts from this process of really like building layer by layer to increase resolution. I love that. And, a lot of that is translating into also different kinds of worlds of skills. And Chris, I wonder if, this is something maybe you also want to talk a bit about, because in the different roles that you've inhabited, in the different forms in which TFI has taken, you've really thought about how to translate these central ideas into different kinds of audiences as well. I think recently you've also started doing, videos on Instagram where you share some of these ideas. So I'm just curious, feel free to pick any of these pathways, but if you could talk a little bit about that.
Hello? Oh, yeah, for sure. I guess the thing I want to touch on is maybe the time when we were running in more of a cultural space in terms of working with collaborators. So I think in that moment, it's a lot of the work we do, especially when it's like just straight up collaborations between another brand or another artist, or it's just more in a setting of convening or space making. It's pretty organic, I would say, for myself, like whether the collaborator is like from online, like on Discord, or they're an actual friend, or we met through Instagram or something like that. And it's a pretty organic process, but I think I definitely cherish the idea of collaboration, because the output or the product or the concept is something pretty much a marriage between the collaborators themselves. So in the context of Cebu, Philippines, it was, I had the pleasure of working with some dear friends, Philip and Roniel and Sayoka, and that sort of the intervention into the space or understanding the space was, trying to understand Cebu as a city and what the sort of stakeholders in the city, because we had access to a cultural space or basically like a gallery space, and sort of understanding how we fit in as a space in a broader cityscape, and then trying to map the individual or the groups that we would collaborate with and interlink with in terms of setting up events. And our first event that we did was a zine fest, and that has since grown on to become Cebu Art Book Fair. But at the time, they're just taking stock of and seeing what was available, and then trying to figure out with the collaborators, what's a leverage point that we can make an impact in, and make an impact in with, at that time it's very DIY, so budgets, everything is we have to think about how much leverage we can create in a system or in this community, and the Zine Fest was really that catalyst for that space for convening and creating other group shows, as well as other sort of programs in that space, and pretty much just creating a flat sort of, I say flat as in transdisciplinary sort of curation for the space, and I think that pretty much sums up how I take on, or Tropical Futures takes on, these sort of these sort of collaborations where it just sort of emerges from a dialogue, and we progressively build on it. I wouldn't say like in terms of sharpening resolution, but more just like kind of building layer on layer, like and then seeing where that sort of goes in a sort of organic sort of form.
Thank you. And Joe, I think I'm curious about, something that both Chris and Lawrence are talking about. So made me think about how do you get, buy-in from not just your collaborators, but sometimes from an audience or from, space, from people who can bring different kinds of resources into the project to make something happen. And, with the collective, for example, you're creating space so that a whole community can come together and feel safe and be themselves in that environment. So how do you maybe navigate, whether that is with, the team, the collective itself, or with your direct collaborators and the wider community? How do you navigate this sense of like a buy-in, whether that's in terms of behavior or in terms of logistically, physically making it happen? Also up to you how you'd like to respond.
Like how people build a dream together or a space together. Well, for my collective, Bussy Temple, we started very small. So it started with a group of friends, and then our first public parties were like 100 people max, and then it grew to like 200, and then it grew into a larger community. So now our parties, I think they're like around 400 to 500 people. So it grows gradually, because when you start with a group of friends and then you bring friends of friends, they're already part of the community. And then as other people outside the community, as they come in, they start to understand what it is, right? What this world building exercise is for everyone. Like we usually have like a rave space and a sanctuary space. So people who can't really get ready in their own homes, like they want to wear makeup, but it's not allowed at home. They're not out to their parents or whatever. They can come prep in our space. So having that like knowledge that people can treat this as a safe space for them to present or express themselves in the way that they want helps to build the safety. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think it grows very slowly, and I don't think we want to grow it any faster, because if not, the sense of community becomes really frayed. Yeah. So every time we gather, we kind of like solidify what we're about and solidify the dream together.
Sounds like what you're offering is also this idea of building out a shared vision through, first of all, shared values, but also through kinship and friendship. And it also sounds like, this ritualistic maybe separation of the space helps people enter into that environment that you're trying to build. And a lot of that is already built into what you offer. And so it ushers people through this experience to be in that, vision together. So I think we've got a couple of minutes left, and I don't think we'll have time for Q&A. You're very welcome to ask the speakers your questions afterwards directly. But before we wrap up the panel, I want to, kind of leave you with one last question, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this. I think what's been so special about being able to have this conversation for me is that oftentimes at, these fairs or like big kind of convenings, we have so many panels talking about like big ideas, right? Like big visions, like futures that we're working on, but so little space to really talk about like what is the nitty-gritty, like what is the work. Lawrence, who talked about this, the amount of work that goes into, speaking with your different collaborators and bringing them on board to do what they do best, but to stay true to that central vision. So it's been really special to actually hear, all three of you break that down, but also to hear the differences, maybe, or the, some different expressions in which you work. But maybe selfishly, I'd really like to hear about what are some strategies that you take which have helped you kind of remain true to that vision over time, but also anything that you might have picked up from your own experiences of negotiation, of navigating different kinds of collaborative tensions, or experience of presenting work in different contexts where you've had to translate that vision. How you've come to understand what it means to build these visions, but also to be in dialogue with different publics. So just to kind of condense that, what are some strategies that you might have in building out these futures in concrete kind of actions and projects? And maybe Chris, if it's okay.
Yeah, sure.
We could start with you.
I'll start. So when we were running the space in the Philippines, there's next to no public funding for arts or cultural spaces. So early onset, you have to sort of think in economic terms in terms of how to sustain a space. So the space there was, well, you do have patrons, but then also thinking from a sort of modal approach of like selling merch. And in the Philippines, it's very common to have sponsors, corporate sponsors. So like leaning into sponsorship, but in the way, I guess we never really hit it. So we would just like full on embrace sponsorship as part of because it's sort of part of the, I would say, visual language too of business and things like that in the Philippines. So. But beyond that, merch also played a part in the space as well. Like we would sell a lot of merch in the States, and we would use that sort of currency arbitrage between selling merch in the States and the peso being more affordable, and sort of having that merch also fund things in Cebu. And then alongside the gallery, the cultural space eventually became a gallery. And then we would also engage in sort of like art sales and commercial art sales. So you sort of have to hustle and think about how you can make ends meet, because they're at the time. I mean, besides the British Council, there wasn't really much cultural grants. So it's constantly thinking about, okay, how can I do this? How do I balance ticketing? Or if we want to do a new media show, okay, how do we sort of, balance that sort of performance with, maybe we do a party with a performance, and sort of thinking in these sort of hybridized ways. And I guess to sum it up, it would just be trying to think in a hybrid form of, and just being open to that different opportunity.
I have this sort of balance between what to sell, how much to price things when it comes to event planning. So that actually takes a huge chunk of our time when we do event planning for my rave collective, because we want to be able to have it be affordable for those who cannot afford normal priced tickets. So we always have a way to make sure we understand that this is for the community. So we price tickets lower and we distribute those to our community first, and then the rest of the people who want to come, they'll pay the normal price ticket. So always keeping in mind that it's for the community and not for profit making, because it's not about that. It's about having fun with your friends and friends of friends. In terms of my art practice, saying no to things that don't really fit your practice, I think is pretty important. And then trying to get funding for the projects that you want to do. So doing a lot of DIY stuff. If there isn't a show that that you belong in, you just make the show, but with a funding that you try to apply yourself. So always making sure that you're doing things that you want to do and not to fit into some other person's box or vision.
I, I don't have that much to add to that, but just to, I guess, summarize like what I've noticed is three things. First one is always have music, which sounds obvious, but actually it's not obvious at all. I think music is, some people either like really love it, and I think for people who really love it, you form your identity and your sense of self and your sense of taste at around the same time as a teenager, really, or as a, in your 20s. And it does change a little bit, but not that much. And it can grow, but I think the foundational thing doesn't expand that much. And when I say, like, why do you start with music, is that it's the easiest way to fill a space. You turn the lights off, and you have music fairly loud if you can. And off of that, it's such a great way to create a collective really out of nothing. It's a kind of magical thing where you transform an environment with very little tools. So if you hate music, then that's not relevant. The second thing is seek deadlines. I'm a huge procrastinator, and the resolution thing is only something that's made sense in retrospect. If I didn't have deadlines, which are like externally or internally given, I would never do anything. So that can come from anywhere. And following on from what Joe was saying, is really try everything, because you start blind. You think you know things, or you're humble enough to know that you don't know things. But reality is you have no idea if anyone will turn up, if anyone will buy anything, if anyone really cares enough. And by and large, like, I've done enough shows with 2 people turn up to know that really you can't measure things in a way that would make you feel fully secure in the future, like ever. So I think, yeah, those 3 things is what I would say.
Thank you. I mean, that's so real. And, I really appreciate all 3 of you for your generosity in sharing, I think, not just like the difficulties of what it means to like work on these ideas and bring them into fruition, but also the persistence, the flexibility that you've adopted along the way to make more things possible. I think just to come back to the title of the panel, Molding Futures, today we really focus a bit more on what that molding looks like. What are the kind of like touch points or the guidelines that you as practitioners foster? But also to maybe kind of bring it back to an earlier panel that we had today called Staying with the Trouble. The moderator, Zoe Butt, kind of brought back to, this incredible quote, it matters what stories make worlds, and it matters what worlds make stories. We didn't really get to go into these worlds that each of you build and foster and nurture too deeply today, but I hope that this panel is a sort of invitation and invocation for you to maybe spend more time with each of these amazing artists into their worlds more deeply in your own time. With Lawrence, you can visit his show currently on at the Art Science Museum. Joe has 2 shows on during Singapore Art Week as well. One of them that you've mentioned is Reworlding at Starch, curated by Debbie Ding. And with Chris, he has work in the Biennale, but also you can follow Tropical Futures Institute on Instagram. So I invite you to really spend more time with these worlds from today. And with that, thank you so much. Thank you, Rafi, and thank you, Artist GNC Focus, for having us.